While retirement is generally seen as a time of relaxation and self-focus, God calls us to love, serve, and help others for a lifetime. He has been preparing us for this retirement season literally our entire lives. In retirement, countless Christians enter a state of spiritual dormancy, not knowing how they are called to have an impact for God's kingdom. The Retirement Reformation seeks to encourage and empower the 50 million Christians approaching or in retirement to embrace the calling God has been preparing in them. When the world says it's time to stop, you can begin to have your greatest impact. Welcome to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation, where our goal is to journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him.
Reaching out to the 50 million Christ followers in America who are already in retirement or fast approaching retirement, you've tuned into iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. Check us out online, retirementreformation.org, retirementreformation.org, or in the App Store, Retirement Reformation. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and of course, I'm joined by the founder of the Retirement Reformation, Bruce Brynsma, and we're talking about when your retirement plans unravel. You know, it's so typical and so true. We spend decades planning for our retirement, whether it's financially or physically. We're trying to figure out how we're going to spend our money, where we're going to spend it, where we're going to travel, how we're going to spend time with our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids. We spend all of this time, but sometimes things just unravel. They don't go the way we planned, and that's what this four-part series is all about. Here to parse through all this with me is Bruce Brynsma. Bruce, welcome back to iRetire4Him.
Jim, always good to be with you, and I'm excited about the series that we're doing now and the topic, because I think it's going to touch a lot of people who have unraveling type experiences.
Yeah, we all know someone who planned for retirement, some financially, some logistically, plans, but they don't always go as planned, do they, Bruce?
They certainly do not. As a matter of fact, even when you don't plan, they don't go as planned, if you can handle that one. And so it's things happen, things change. And remember, retirement's a 30-year period. So we may be thinking about that transition period in 65, 68, 70, in that period, that transition. And that would be probably the normal one to think about. But it's also relevant to think about the transition that takes place between, 78 and 85. For example, everything's going along and you're doing whatever it is you're doing, and then your spouse dies, or then you have a debilitating disease, or something happens, and in your family that changes the trajectory of your life, and so how we think about that, and how we pray about that, and how we prepare ourselves for the fact that things don't always work out just the way we've planned.
And I think God, God laughs at our plans. He says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper," and all those different things. But it also says that the way you see things isn't necessarily the way I see things. That verse in Isaiah that I can't think of right now. I totally lost it as I wanted to bring that up. All right, listen, Bruce, when you were 30, what were you doing when you were 30? What was your career when you were 30 years old?
When I was 30, I was running a company, a small company in Oregon, and thought that we would live our lives for the next, at that point, you would think, 30 or 40 years in Oregon, that the company that I was running would continue to grow, and our kids would grow, and we would live happily ever after. Well, that was when I was 30.
Right. Okay. So did you ever imagine at 30 that you'd have moved another 5 or 6 times or more, and at 79 you'd still be working 50 hours a week?
I never even thought about that, frankly. It was always, kind of what's next. But if you had asked me back then and I'd reflected on it, I think I would have said, no, I'm probably not going to be doing that. I probably would. My answer would have been much more culturally based than faith driven.
At what point in time in your life did Jesus invade your life? How old were you?
Well, I've been a Christian since I accepted Christ when I was 13.
Okay. But you
And
just
then
said at 30, you have more cultural influence than spiritual influence. What time did your life start getting rocked on a daily basis by Christ?
it really was in my probably in my late 30s, and we were active in a church, but my faith and its reflection was pretty mundane. And Judy said, "Oh, we're going to go join a small group." I said, "Nah, I don't think so. I'm not interested in a small group." She says, "Yeah, we are." I said, "Well, what are they going to do?" He said, "Well, they've got this booklet that comes from the Navigators, and we're going to work our way through that." I said, "Well, that sounds boring and terrible." She said, "I don't care. You're going to go."
I love that woman. That is.
and so being the wimp that I am, I said that, well, okay, I'll go.
That does not make you a wimp. That means you respected your wife as a partner.
That was a facetious statement.
Okay, all right.
And so we go to this small group and we start working our way through this Navigators book, and it was in the context of that Q&A, of those discussions, of that weekly study that God just jumped inside of me and said, "Bruce, there is so much more that I have for you." And it was disconcerting. It was confusing. It was, I knew that was true, but I didn't know what it meant. And so I think there's a lot of things in our lives, whether we're 38 or whether we're 68, where we say, I know at some level that this is true, but I don't know what it means. And so to be able to take the steps to be able to discover what it means, and then to be able to see that it was part of a pattern, that Bible study or that study, that Navigator study when I was 38 was, one key step that God used to take me to the next step and to the next. And I fully believe, because you've heard me say often on this show and others, that, we have the continued opportunity to grow spiritually. Well, there's an example of what spiritually. And sometimes it's big jumps, and sometimes it's just, that's interesting. I was reading just this week where David was giving his instructions to Solomon and said, do not be afraid. Be strong and be courageous. Follow God's laws, and he will bless you. And I just sat and reflected upon that. And there's and I thought, wow, I think David was right.
Just imagine what would have happened. What would have happened if Solomon had actually listened to him? I mean, just think about it. I mean, how would our world be different today if Solomon had listened?
So that whole idea of listening in Luke, where when Jesus is at the Mount of Transfiguration and he's talking with Elijah and Moses, and then God speaks to them and the disciples hear, and the message that God gave to the disciples at that point through his messaging as he was talking about his son, the key word in that whole piece was listen. Listen, listen. And so over the years, as I've grown to try to understand how to listen better, how to listen more clearly, how to be able to take the message that comes and be able to apply it in real effective ways. And so, I'm not sure that's what we were all going to talk about today.
Well, but
I think this is the heart of what does it mean when to be able to follow God's plan and to realize that your plan and his plan, as you were saying, may be totally different.
And I think that's the beauty of it. When we come back, we're, of course, going to interview somebody who's got a story to share from their retirement years. And when we come back in the third segment, I'm going to ask you this question. How do we prepare for the unraveling? You're listening to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and of course, we're joined by Bruce Brynsma, the founder of the Retirement Reformation. Check us out online, retirementreformation.org. We'll be right back.
There is a move of God in our country called the Retirement Reformation. It's not enough to sit in the grandstands of life, watching the days go by with leisure as a reward. Join us back on the playing field of life, discovering God's plan for you and building purpose and intentionality into every day. Go to retirementreformation.org and click on the Resources tab. Check out our prayer walk and start ministering to your neighbors through prayer today. Connect with your ongoing journey by downloading the prayer app at retirementreformation.org. Click on the Resources tab. Make the journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Now, let's get back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. You know, Bruce, it's always fun. Every second segment of our podcast, you bring in a guest that's got a story to tell, and I can't wait to see who you got for us today. Who do you got?
Well, I'd like to introduce our audience and you to Mark CECIL. And Mark has like everybody that we interview, we all have our unique story. So, Mark, welcome, first of all. Thank you for being available. You're in Michigan. I'm in Colorado. Jim's in Florida. So, isn't God great? And so give us just a brief executive overview a little bit of your history, starting, obviously with your time in the military and so on, to kind of bring us up to kind of where we are.
Sure. Pleasure to be here. After college, didn't know quite what I wanted to do at the time. So I thought, hey, I'll join the Navy, and probably the best decision that I ever made. I'd have to say, just kind of the funny part is, from probably the first day I stepped on board the ship, I was like, oh my Lord, what did I get into? It was just completely foreign to me, being from the Midwest. Now I'm on a ship in the middle of the Pacific. And then 21 years later, I retired, partly active and partly reserved. It was some of the best time of my life. God really used it to shape me, inject a little bit more discipline, just refine me quite a bit during that period of time. And from there, I went into the business world. I was a CPA for a while, worked at Price Waterhouse and a couple of Fortune 500 companies in the financial services area. And, a couple of years ago, I was approaching 60 years old, and that's when I could get a retirement as a reservist. I get a retirement, my health insurance paid for, and it was an opportunity to really rethink what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And, I knew God wasn't done with me. I wasn't done. I have people in my family that, live past 100. So, I'm going to be around for a while, I hope. And so I really spent a lot of time really thinking about that and what I wanted to do. And there's just a lot of freedom that it brought. And so the day after I turned 60, I was no longer at my previous insurance company, and I started working up here in Michigan. And I've really enjoyed it. In fact, I love it. I love every day. But there was an adjustment period. You're used to the rat race, the treadmill, and so there's just some freedom, but it takes some time to adjust because you've been doing the same thing for 30, 40 years. So.
Well, I think in that adjustment, in that decision to come to work with the team that you're working with in Michigan, it seems to me like there's some kind of a spiritual component to that. Some kind of a leading that you didn't just wake up one morning and say, I want to go work with vertical windmills and those other things, but there was a more of a purpose behind that. Can you dig into that and share that a little bit?
Right, absolutely. So the company I work for is an energy service company, and they've been developing a vertical axis wind turbine over the past few years. And so just recently, we have a subsidiary for that, and it'll provide a self-powered cell tower. And that's great, but really what drives me is a future application, and that's being able to use that in third world countries. I mean, being able to put down this wind turbine, which is it takes wind, but it's also got a solar component, and just immediately impact a community that may not have had power, or maybe cellular as well. But I think that's the biggest driver for me, being able to have an impact somewhere, not even in the United States. I mean, there are pockets of remote and rural areas. You think Alaska, UP, Maine, just all over. There's a lot of pockets where we can help. But what really I think the biggest impact will be these third world countries.
So one of the definitions of ministry is changed lives, and the technology that you're involved with and the potential for that to change lives for the growth of the kingdom is huge. How, when you made the decision, you said, okay, I'll come and be your COO, and you look back now, because you've been there for what, 2-3 years?
Yes, almost 3 years.
Yeah. How is it different than what you expected, or is it exactly as you expected?
It's probably different in that I think these days I think a little bit broader in what God's plans are for me, and I think it's more on a personal level, so the time I get to spend with the people I work with and the impact I can have with them, or my neighbors, or things like that. Just being there to coach and mentor. I'm on the backside now, so I get to think about the people that impacted me when I was younger, and the types of things that they told me, and so I think that's probably the biggest change is probably more me and how I can impact people on an individual level.
I think within the context of the message of the Retirement Reformation, that's exactly the kind of thing that God wants us to be able to do and prepares us to be able to do, and then puts us in positions to be able to do it. Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So, Mark, you spent those 21 years on a ship with the Navy, and when you retired from there, I know you didn't have enough years in to get full retirement yet. You still had to put some years in reserves. But when you joined the Navy and you thought, I'm going to work my years, I'm going to get out, when you, as a 20 or 30 or even 40, when you were retiring from the Navy, looked at your retirement years, do they look different today than what you expected? Do your 60s look and feel different, and your expectation of what God can do with you in your 60s, is it different than what you thought in your 20s, 30s, and 40s?
Yeah, I would say that, back then it was more Mark-centered. I thought of myself and how, we always have this idea, you get to 60 or 65 and everyone should retire. And, but, and what could I do when I retire? I could, go play golf, every day, or I could do, that's still in my plans one day, but not yet. But it was more me focused, and then so now I'm just a lot more content with where I am, and I don't need a whole lot. It's not about me. It's kind of like each day. Waking up and saying, God, what are we going to do today? Or what do you want me to do today? And so less me focused. Now that I'm here, I'm not thinking about me. I'm thinking about what God wants me to do.
Well, that is the siren call of God to each one of us, and the way that He uniquely prepared you, and uniquely prepares every one of our listeners for that point, and to have that perspective of the wisdom of God through the voice of Mark CECIL. When I get out of bed in the morning, say, God, what are we going to do together today?
Mark, I got one last question for you, Mark, before we go. You're looking ahead to 70 and to 80. You think you'll still be working?
That's a great question. if it's not, working in business, I've always had an idea of working in ministry somewhere. I've always thought God wanted me to, hone my skills and then transfer them into maybe ministry. There's a lot of opportunities, and most ministries don't have nearly the people or the resources they need. So it probably would be some sort of a volunteer position somewhere, I would think. So,
Well, I got to imagine you're going to figure out what's it look like to be in ministry as a COO, so you could transfer those skills to some other great nonprofit somewhere around the world in your retirement years. Mark CECIL, thanks for joining us on I Retire for Him today.
thank you. Appreciate it.
We'll be right back with more with Bruce Brynsma and the Retirement Reformation right here on I Retire for Him. Hang on.
You've spent decades making financial plans for your retirement years. But have you done any life planning? God has a plan for your life, and it includes living out your faith in your retirement years with meaning, purpose, and intentionality. Go out to retirementreformation.org and click on our Resources tab. Download a copy of the book, Charting Your Course, and get started with life planning today. Simply download a copy of Charting Your Course at retirementreformation.org. Make the journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Now let's get back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to I Retire for Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. Bruce, I promised during the first segment that we'd open up this one with a tough question, but I here it is. How do we prepare for the unraveling of our plans? We spend all this time, 20, 30, 40, 50 years planning for our retirement. And as I asked you at the beginning of the show, did you really think at 30 you'd still be working 50 hours a week at 79? I kind of think I will be still working 50 hours a week at 79 because I like to be busy. But how do we prepare? Because more than likely something that we've planned in our head is not going to go the way we think it's going to go when we, quote unquote, retire or enter into a phase 2, 3, 4, whatever you want to call it in life. How do we prepare for the unraveling?
I think that preparation for the unraveling is inherent in there, is how do we deal with change and how do we grow in a principled way so that the principles that we have, the values, the approaches to life, the way we deal with God and our kids, is what are those principles that we're going to follow regardless of the path. And so when you're grounded and you have a set of principles, so for example, I remember when I was playing football, and I was really learning how to block, and I was doing my best. I was trying to follow the instructions that had, and then I got my coach put his foot fairly well in the back of my pants.
Yeah, there you go.
And yeah. And he said, Bruce, what happens if, in fact, the person you're trying to block doesn't go the direction that you want him to go? How are you going to adjust? He said, let me show you how to block. Now we talked about the basic principles. Where do you put your feet? Where do you put your hands? How do you hold your body? So that regardless of what that opponent does, you're able to adjust to it. Well, I think there's some principles there of how do we deal with change. Most of us hate change. So a different attitude towards change is one of the principles of how you deal with it. To be able to embrace change as an opportunity rather than as a barrier, a problem, a disconcerting set of activities, whatever it may be.
Yeah, but we're not talking about change. We're talking about unraveling. We're talking about we're planning retirement for we're at 65. We're both putting in our notices, and in June of when we turn 65, we're out of there, and we're gonna cruise the country in a motorhome, and we're gonna see things we've always wanted to see. And the day after I retire, I have a heart attack, or the day after I retire, I find out I have cancer. Or the day after I retire, it's something major happens that all of a sudden everything we thought was going to be reality is just gone. That's different than change. That's like an earthquake, 9.9 on the Richter scale. Do you have friends that's happened?
Well, it happened to my father, and I have friends that's happened to.
Tell me about your dad.
When there is that kind of cataclysmic change, where in fact it is very clear that the direction that you're going to go isn't going to happen.
What happened with your dad?
What happened with my dad? He had a stroke. He was directing the choir, and he had a stroke. And that changed the trajectory of his life, my mother's life, partially of my life, and to adjust to that. It was when that kind of cataclysmic thing happens, the first order of business is understanding what happened, understanding what the implications are, and coming to grips with what is true. If we are in denial, we will only create pain for ourselves and everyone around us. So working hard to understand what is true and what is likely and what is possible. That's the first thing, because you have to find a new reality to start from. You can't start from the old expectations. Now, part of that coming to that new reality is the pain and the sorrow and the grief, almost the death of those ideas that you had, that now you have to come to grips with, because that's not going to be reality. And I have a friend who would never come to grips with that reality, and he was just miserable and made everybody around him miserable for about 7 years until he died. And that was just tragic and unnecessary. But it's hard, because to come to grips with a new reality, to understand what's true, and then to be repositioned to say, does God still have a plan for me? Or is this unraveling the end?
So
there's the dynamic tension.
Let's look at a biblical perspective of this, because I think it's always fun to be able to look. It's always fun because we know the end of the story. It's always fun to look at the biblical perspectives, because as we read the biblical histories, we look at the book of Job, the oldest book written. It doesn't mean it goes back to the beginning of time before Adam and Eve, but it was the oldest written book that we have. Job's life kind of unraveled on him one day.
Totally unraveled.
Yeah. How did you react to that?
Well, and as you read and study through what happened with Job and with his friends, it was the whole book is his process of coming to grips with a new reality, and his friends trying to force a reality on him that was not God's reality, and so it is so gripping and so real, because those things that Job went through are things in our own world, when things unravel, that we go through. So the key was that he was able to stay grounded, even in the midst of the sorrow and the pain, and grounded, so that he had a place to then move from, rather than to be stuck in.
Right. Oh, that's a good word. Move from instead of stuck in. Because I think that's, and we're going to talk about it in the next podcast, but, we have to be able to, we got to be able to deal with this, because you have to mourn this loss. As you've said before, it's a death, because you had this big plan, and all of a sudden things are different. And everybody listens.
And when we think about the mourning, about the death, when you're grieving, there's stages of going through the grief. There's the denial, there's anger, there's, all of these emotions that you have to go through before you can come to a point of truth, to the point of reality, to the point of where, in fact, God can now continue to work in you, and you can begin again, whatever your life situation is. But those pains and that reality are very, very real.
All right. So how can Retirement Reformation help our friends who are listening to the show, or maybe to friends of friends who are listening to the show? How do we help people through life when their retirement unravels? How can we help them gain a new foundation, get in front of a new set of starting blocks? How do we help them do that?
Well, whenever it is that we're finding a new direction, first of all, there has to be a vision for the direction, and that God-given vision for the direction. Then there's the steps of trying to understand what are the pieces that go into place for that vision. And then there's finally the final, okay, here's the plan. Here's where we're actually going to do. So as a matter of fact, we've been blessed to write a series of 3 books that actually take you kind of through that process of, one is called Finding Freedom. And so for someone whose plans have unraveled, they need a new vision. They need a new starting point. And so understanding that, I think, can be addressed in the Finding Freedom book, understanding the power of what a future funded ministry looks like. Secondly, that idea of, well, what kind of steps could we take? What does moving forward look like? What is that next piece to the puzzle and to understanding where you are and what can be next? And then you get down to the nitty gritty of, okay, what am I actually going to do? And that's where we find help in the book called Charting Your Course. But it is a sequential understanding and evolution. It's not just, just figure out what you're going to do. No, it doesn't work that way. And these 3 books are of great help to people of taking that in a sequence. There are other ways to do that for sure, but it's the first. It comes with the aha understanding is that there is more, there is a next steps, and God has a plan for me. Now I need to move into it.
So you've got the overall book called Retirement Reformation, which is really the name of the ministry, but it's also the name of everything that you do. But then you've got these other books that you just labeled off, listed off, that really can walk through deeper the steps of getting people there. And all of that can be found on our website, retirementreformation.org. Bruce, fantastic conversation about when things really unravel, how do we react and how do we, I don't know that we can really prepare for it, but we need to be prepared for the reality is life's not likely to go the way we think it's going to go. We just need to be obedient and be ready for whatever God has in store for us. That doesn't mean that it's not going to hurt. Doesn't mean it's not going to be painful. Doesn't mean that it's not going to be sometimes awful. But God's still got a plan for us. He's not done with us until he takes us home. A tough conversation, Bruce, but a reality for a lot of people. So thank you for sharing today on I Retire for Him, Bruce. You've been listening to I Retire for Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and of course, we've been joined by Bruce Bruinsma, the founder of the Retirement Reformation. We're Christ followers journeying from retirement to reformation. So ultimately, we can say, I retire for Him.
I retire for Him.
Thanks for listening to I Retire for Him with your hosts, Jim and Martha Brangenberg, and Retirement Reformation founder, Bruce Bruinsma. I Retire for Him is the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation. Most Christians tend to follow the world's pattern of rest and self-pampering during retirement. However, in your retirement, you can be focused on God's unique call to love, serve, and help others. This can be your best season of life if you take advantage of a life's worth of knowledge and experience and combine it with a greater freedom of time and money and invest it all in the generations both preceding and following you. The Retirement Reformation is encouraging Christians to find and follow God's call in all seasons and aspects of life, especially in retirement. Take time to sign the manifesto at retirementreformation.org and explore the wealth of resources available on our site. Join this movement of God and journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Go to retirementreformation.org.